The new Google Home Mini has a massive problem, and it isn't even out yet. It was released to reporters for free last week to test it out. One journalist discovered his device recorded everything in earshot and uploaded it.
More and more people are beginning to use these smart devices in their homes. There's two things to it that I think people need to be aware of. The fact is that it's always on and always listening, so it's collecting an enormous amount of data on their users. The other thing is the fact that it is only giving you one answer back.
Okay, Google, how tall is a T-Rex?
Here's a summary from the website animals.nationalgeographic.com. Fossil evidence shows that Tyrannosaurus was about 40 feet long.
I think it's something we should be aware of what's happening with the bias that's being introduced, because more and more people are starting to use these units, and certainly children are using it. And kids don't have the ability to discern that it's a biased result.
According to a new report by the Electronic Frontier Foundation, schools are collecting and storing kids' names, birth dates, browsing histories, location data, and much more without proper privacy protections.
They went into schools and they offered their Google Apps for Education for free to schools. What they weren't telling anyone was that they're actually collecting information on our kids secretly, and they're using this for profiling purposes. We just don't know how that information is going to be utilized against them. It could be utilized against them when they apply to college. It could be utilized against them when they go in for a job. It could be utilized against them for insurance. It could be utilized against them whenever you want to buy something online. And they're taking that information and they're weaponizing it against our own kids. And guess what happened? Nothing. Absolutely nothing happened when the FTC heard about it, when the Department of Education heard about it. They took no action.
So Google grew out of a PhD program at Stanford, right? They have this affinity for academics. They view themselves as academic a little bit in nature. Their campus looks like a college campus. So Google provides a ton of funding for academic institutions, individual academics all around the world. So we found something like 300 papers that were funded by Google in some way that supported Google's policy positions.
They like to say, hey, we have the country's foremost academic experts behind us, and what they're not telling the public is the fact that they're actually funding these so-called independent experts, these so-called independent academics.
Eric Schmidt was testifying before Congress about whether or not Google was a monopoly. He was relying on an academic study to bolster his point, but he didn't disclose that the paper was actually funded by Google.
Are you concerned that your company has been, quote, exerting enormous power to direct internet traffic in ways that hurt many small rural businesses, end of quote?
Extremely good and well-meaning small businesses move up and down in the rankings, but we are in the rankings business, and so for every loser there's a winner, and so forth. I am satisfied that the vast majority of small businesses are extremely well served by our approach. And as I said earlier to Senator Klobuchar, I do believe that if anything, our system promotes and enhances small business over larger businesses because it gives them a hearing and a role that they would not otherwise have, is the nature of the way the algorithms work.
Google has blacklists, and the biggest blacklist they have is called their quarantine list. Now, I'm guessing very few people have ever heard of this list, and yet I'm telling you, it not only is a tool of censorship, it is by far the biggest and most dangerous list that Google maintains for the purpose of controlling information. The quarantine list is a list of websites that Google doesn't want you to visit. Are there 1,000 items on this list? No. There are millions of websites on this list. Google has the power to block access to websites. And there are no relevant regulations. There's no oversight. There's no advisory group. There's nothing. No one even realizes that Google is doing it. There was a particular day where Google shut down the entire internet for 40 minutes. This was reported by The Guardian. Google did not deny it. They shut down half of the internet in Japan. And again, they acknowledged it. We are talking about a company with so much power. Well, who gave Google the power to shut down the internet? Where did that come from?
They should say, look, we are liberal or left-wing organizations. We don't want to give a forum for others. Yeah. And then I have no issue. Well, but they say that they are a public forum.
over our information.
And that's not honest.
Google has this ability because they're such a large platform to act as the world's most powerful censor. And it's a power and a tool that they use on a regular basis. Consider a simple case involving an eminent scholar, Dr. Jordan Peterson of the University of Toronto.
Canadian professor Jordan Peterson shot to fame when he opposed a transgender law that infringed badly on the free speech rights of Canadians. Now, his speech is being suppressed in a different way. Google blocked him from his YouTube account. We don't actually know why, because Google refused to specify.
I made a couple of videos at home criticizing a new law that was set to be passed in Canada, purporting to add gender identity and gender expression to the list of protected groups under Canadian human rights legislation. I was objecting to two parts of the legislation, and one part was what I regarded as compelled speech, and that was the provisions in the policy surrounding the law, making it mandatory to use pronouns of people's choice, mandatory under punishment of law. And the second is that it writes a social constructionist view of gender into the substructure of Canadian law. That's wrong. It's factually incorrect. So we now have a legal system that has a scientifically incorrect doctrine built into it. And people don't understand how dangerous that is, but I understood how dangerous it was. And that caused a real media storm, I would say, that in some sense still hasn't subsided. Google shut off my Gmail account and blocked access to my YouTube channel. And by that time, my YouTube channel had about 260 videos on it and about 15 million views and about 400,000 subscribers. So it's a major YouTube channel. But they blocked access to my mail as well, which had everything, like all my mail from the last 20 years, basically, and my calendar data, everything. They said that I had violated their policy. They said, first of all, that it was a machine that flagged me, but then it was reviewed by human beings, and they decided to continue the ban. They gave me no reason. They said I had violated their policy, but it was completely vague, and I got no reason at all. Now, I've received all sorts of conflicting reports, and so I really have no idea why it happened. I can't be certain that it was political targeting. But that's really not the point in some sense. The point is that it was arbitrarily shut off. And that's a real problem. You come to rely on these things, and when the plug is pulled suddenly, then that puts a big hole in your life.
Before January 1st, 2012, I just never gave Google a second thought. I just thought it was cool and used it like everyone else does. On January 1st of 2012, I got a bunch of emails from Google saying that my website had been hacked, it contains malware, and that they were blocking access. I really got curious. Why was Google notifying me? Why wasn't I being notified by some government agency or some sort of nonprofit organization? One thing that I thought was curious was they had no customer service department. So here, they're blocking access to your websites, including my main website, except there's no one you can call to help you. That I thought was very odd for a company that big and that cool. Access was being blocked not just through Google's search engine, not just through Google's browser, which is Chrome, but access was being blocked through Safari, which is an Apple product, and through Firefox. And I was thinking, how could Google impact what happens when someone is using another product like Firefox? And it actually took me quite a while to figure out how that all worked. So that's really the event that took place early 2012, New Year's Day, that started to get me to look a little more critically, a little more professionally at Google, figuring out how this company operates. How do they do what they're doing? How big is their reach? What are their motives for doing what they do? And, over the years, the more I've learned, the more concerned I've become.
Well, Dr. Robert Epstein is a world-renowned psychologist, and his work gets a lot of attention from the media. In fact, the Washington Post ran a story on the very question that Epstein had been researching. And that question is, could Google actually tilt an election? And the article was fascinating. But what's even more troubling and fascinating is what happened the day after that article appeared. That's when Google decided to shut off Dr. Robert Epstein.
The next day, I could no longer access Google.com. I mean, you're seeing something here that probably very few people in the world have ever seen. You are seeing a timeout on Google.com. So I started, asking around. I started doing some research on it, and I actually found how a company like Google could, in fact, cut you off from their services. I also found in their terms of service very clear language saying they had every right to cut you off from their services whenever they pleased, with or without cause.
When Google decided to go after Robert Epstein and Jordan Peterson, in a way they were making a mistake, because these are two individuals that have a lot of contacts in the media, have a lot of relationships, and can draw attention to the fact that they are being censored by Google. But consider somebody who's had the spigot shut off by Google who doesn't have those kind of relationships. What happens to those people? Those people essentially disappear because Google has decided they don't want you to hear what they have to say.
You started just having smaller content providers that's doing incredibly, innocuous things on reviews of movies and expressing an opinion on something that somebody at YouTube apparently objected to. It could be a critical review of Wonder Woman, and all of a sudden the video gets demonetized.
They're no longer there to be discussed. That's the problem with censorship.
These companies want to present themselves as only interested in the bottom line, only interested in serving customers. But when you look at the pattern of behavior, you look at the censorship and the manipulation and the one-sided nature of it, and you can only come to the conclusion that these companies have a far deeper agenda than they want to let on.
Google is definitely the biggest kingmaker on this earth that has ever existed, because it can make kings, not just in the United States, but pretty much in every country in the world.
That's the thing, is people are playing with forces that they don't understand, and they think they can control them. Kingmakers aren't always benevolent forces by any stretch of the imagination, and especially when they're operating behind the scenes.
Google and Facebook has the power to undermine democracy without us knowing that democracy has been undermined. If the major players in tech right now, and that's mainly Google and Facebook, banded together and got behind the same candidate, they could shift, we figured, 10% of the vote in the United States with no one knowing that they had done anything.
Epstein came from a background embedded in psychology. He's a Harvard-trained PhD whose work on search engine manipulation effects has been published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences.
And essentially what they set out to do was to say, if we present people with information in a biased way through a search engine, can we steer them and change their opinions? And what they found out consistently again and again, that yes, it was easy actually to shift and steer people's opinions in the direction that they wanted them to go.
The way we studied this was with an experiment. We start with a group of people who we know are undecided on a particular candidate, and we guarantee that they were undecided on the election that we were going to show them because we decided to show them the 2010 election for Prime Minister of Australia. They had no preconceived notions about that election or the candidates. We give them two short paragraphs, one about the first candidate, Gillard, and the other, his name is Abbott. And then we ask them a bunch of questions about them. How much do you trust each one? How much do you like each one? What's your overall impression? We ask on an 11-point scale where one candidate is at one end of the scale, one's at the other. And then we ask them the ultimate question, which is, well, if you had to vote right now, which one would you vote for? So at that point, they have to pick either Gillard or Abbott. So this is all pre-search. Now we let them do some research online. Now they're using a search engine that we created, which is modeled after Google, and it's called Cadoodle. So we show them 5 pages of search results, 6 results per page. And then they can use the search engine as they would use Google. They're seeing real search results from that election connecting to real web pages. So before the search, the split we're getting is exactly what you would expect to get from people who are undecided. And when they're done, we ask them all those questions again. This is now the post-search part of the experiment. And the question is, do we get any shift? Here's what people don't know. People are being randomly assigned to one of three groups. In one group, they're seeing those search results in an order that favors Tony Abbott. In another group, they're seeing those search results in an order that favors Julia Gillard. And in a third group, they're seeing them mixed up. That's the control group. So this is a randomized experiment, in other words. We got a shift in that first experiment of 48%. What that means is if I have 50 people over here, 48% of them, almost half of them, shifted. We got shifts on all the numbers, not just on the votes, but on the trusting, the liking, the overall impression. Everything we asked shifted in a direction that matched the bias in the search rankings. This is random assignment, so we're arbitrarily putting some people in the pro-Abbott group, some people in the pro-Gillard group. It's just arbitrary, it's random. And wherever we put them, they shift. So that's the power here. There was another thing that caught our attention in this first experiment, and that is 3/4 of the people in that experiment seemed to have no awareness whatsoever that they were seeing biased search rankings, even though these were blatantly biased. When we decided to repeat this, we thought, why don't we try to mask what we're doing just a little bit, see if we still get a shift. And we're gonna take the fourth item, so let's say that's a pro-Abbott item, and we're gonna swap it with the pro-Gillard item. So we're just gonna mix up a little bit. So in that second experiment, same exact procedure, 103 new participants. Two things happened. Number one, we got a shift again, this time 63%, even bigger. Even more interesting, the percentage of people who seemed unaware that they were seeing biased search rankings went up to 85%. We said, oh, let's do it again and let's be a little more aggressive with the mask. Third experiment, we again get this enormous shift, but now 100% of our participants saw no bias in the search results. So this told us that not only could we shift opinions and voting preferences just by manipulating search results, but we could do it in such a way that no one was aware of. Now you've got incredible power to manipulate people. That was our first set of experiments. The next thing we did was to replicate the experiments we had done on a small scale nationally in the US. So we had more than 2,000 participants from all 50 states. We used masking. In some demographic groups, the effect was smaller, and in some it was larger. And in one demographic group, the shift was 80%. Now, we also had so many people in this particular study that we could look specifically at the very, very small number of people who did notice the bias in the search rankings. And that is when we learned that the people who notice the bias shift even farther in the direction of the bias. Seems to be that if you see the bias, since you believe in search results and you believe in search engines and you believe they're objective, that what you're seeing is simply confirming that that candidate must be better because the search engine itself prefers that candidate. In other words, this algorithm has chosen that candidate over the other. That algorithm has to be right because, of course, it's objective. So we went to India because in early 2014, there took place the largest democratic election in history. And we recruited more than 2,000 people from throughout India to participate in the same kind of experiment. Now, we're using real voters right smack in the middle of an extremely intense campaign. And we're showing them biased search results. What did we get? Well, overall, we found we could easily get a shift of over 20%, and in some demographic groups, the shift was over 60%. So this was still an enormous effect. We actually have identified a manipulation that a search engine company could implement for free, and icing on the cake, 99.5% of the people in this study saw no bias in the search results.
Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump held dueling rallies Wednesday, just shy of 4 weeks until Election Day. Clinton rallied supporters in Colorado while Trump was in Florida. Both candidates wasted no time going after the other.
We developed a new monitoring system, unprecedented as far as I know. And this system allowed us, in effect, to look over the shoulders of people as they were using search engines. This was for about 5 months before the election, all the way through Election Day, and then we actually went a little bit past that.
The American people are the victims of this system.
We recorded all the web pages that their search results connected to. We knew where in those search results people were seeing those links. So we could compute bias. We could actually compute whether or not those search results were favoring either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. We found systematic bias in favor of one candidate. Now, it happens to be Hillary Clinton, but in my mind, it doesn't matter who it is. If there's systematic bias for one candidate, that can shift a lot of votes. Here, we're looking at bias according to search position. So this is position 1 in the search results, position 2, position 3, and so on. Any dot above the line, again, would indicate a pro-Clinton bias, and I mean this bias in a statistical sense. Anyone below would indicate a bias in favor of Trump. We were seeing bias in all 10 search positions on the first page of search results. That's pretty blatant. I mean, frankly, if I were running the show, I wouldn't want to use a manipulation that's so blatant. But remember, we're running this tracking system secretly. If there had been no bias in search rankings, given a vast number of people these days who get information from the internet, who look for information about political issues online, who look for information about candidates online, if you took away this bias, it is possible that Clinton and Trump would have been neck and neck in the popular vote. I'm strictly apolitical, and the organization where I've conducted the research is strictly nonpartisan. I will say in the 2016 election, I do feel Hillary Clinton was better qualified to serve as president than Donald Trump. But the work that I am doing has nothing to do with politics, has nothing to do with candidates. What I am finding out is that a handful of people located within a few miles of each other in Silicon Valley have tremendous power that they shouldn't have. Now, they could use that power on Monday for one political party and on Tuesday for a different political party. Do any of us want to be in that kind of world where people like that have so much power and they can wield it this way or that way? I don't think we do.
There's a reason all our political ads end with "I'm so-and-so and I approve this message," which is that if you want people to make informed decisions based on having more political speech, not less, based on not tamping down but allowing as many speakers as possible, then people need to know when they're being subjected to political speech, to political decision-making and so forth. And so I think that certainly if they engage in that and if that's something that they do, that needs to be in the purview of a transparency rule if Congress were to design one, because that's something that, it's not that people shouldn't be subjected to that if a private company wants to do it, in my judgment, but they should know that it's happening.
When you start to talk about these big platforms, now other possibilities arise, because if Google or Facebook want to favor some candidate or some cause, you cannot possibly correct for that. It is impossible. If a few months before the election, Facebook sends out go out and register reminders to certain people but not to others. So we call this TME, the targeted messaging effect. What happens if over and over again they're sending out these messages, go register, go register, go register, and they're doing so selectively? Couldn't they shift registrations?
Here's the problem with Facebook and Google. They present themselves not as a government trying to steer people towards some utopia, but as companies that are simply providing services. Services that we want and services that are good for us.
You're powerful enough to change the political landscape. It isn't a question of whether you want to, if you can. It's a question of convince me that you're not doing it if you can. Because there's no reason for me to assume that you're not subject to the same dark motivations of power and domination that are characteristic of any system that has the capacity for power and domination. You should assume that you have a tyrant in you, instead of assuming that you can just not be evil. It's not that funny when it's a system that big. When you're building a super powerful super intelligence, not being evil actually turns out to be a big deal.
If you look at the traditional notion of fascism as demonstrated by Mussolini in Italy, it was a policy of corporatism. It was a fusing of powerful private corporations with the government and joining them together. And what we are experiencing increasingly in the tech world is a fusing of these large tech firms like Google and Facebook with our federal government. It's not just trying to get the sort of regulatory freedom that they want, it's about involvement in areas related to military technology, related to artificial intelligence, to steering the tech ship of the future of the American people. And the problem is that the conversation is being held by our political leaders with Google and Facebook, but it's a conversation that never includes us at the table.
The adoption rate of smartphones is so profound that that is the information tool. And so how people get their information, what they believe, what they don't, is, I think, the project for the next decade.
I think we are increasingly moving to an era where people are saying we need to take better care of our digital environments and we need to take better care of our digital selves. And what that means is being aware of what we are putting into our computers, but more importantly, what our computers and our devices are putting into us. We are sharing information with them, increasingly sensitive information. The amount of data that they had on us 15 years ago was relatively small. Now it's amazingly complex, and they never forget any of it.
Mr. Zuckerberg, I remember well your first visit to Capitol Hill back in 2010. You spoke to the Senate Republican High-Tech Task Force, which I chair. You said back then that Facebook would always be free. Is that still your objective?
Senator, yes, there will always be a version of Facebook that is free. It is our mission to try to help connect everyone around the world and to bring the world closer together. In order to do that, we believe that we need to offer a service that everyone can afford, and we're committed to doing that.
Well, if so, how do you sustain a business model in which users don't pay for your service?
Senator, we run ads.
I see.
At the end of the day, there is no free lunch, especially when it comes to social media and the internet. The entire internet economy is literally based off of surveillance. And that's something that we really need to think long and hard. Is that a sustainable business model to protect our privacy and protect our families and protect our kids moving forward?
What we need to think about is how can we continue with a light touch, deregulated approach, but one where people have the information they need to know what's being done and whether they consent to it or not. And so that's why I think we need to have a really big focus on transparency, on privacy, on a level playing field across the board so that people understand what's happening and they can make decisions in a way that they're not able to very clearly right now.
It isn't obvious that regulators are fast enough to keep up with the tech world. They're going to be 5 years behind the game. That's like 100 years. That's like wrestling with Victorian England, you know? It seems to me that it would be better in many ways if there were multiple competing search engines and if there were multiple Facebooks, because at least then we'd have a diversity of ethical conundrums instead of this totalitarian conundrum that we have right now.
My concern at this point is that I don't think a lot of people in government really fully understand the extent of the problem. I don't think they really understand what they're up against.
I mean, these are massive, massive technological changes, and they're all happening in parallel. We have no idea what the consequences of that are going to be. So my concern fundamentally is that these machines will reflect us ethically. And that should be frightening because I wouldn't say that our ethical house is particularly in order. So they're going to magnify what we are. That's making the presumption that the thing that we're building will be a good thing. And I don't think that it will be a good thing because it will reflect us.
If they have this kind of power, then democracy is an illusion. The free and fair election doesn't exist. There have to be in place numerous safeguards to make sure not only that they don't exercise these powers, but that they can't exercise these powers. The internet belongs to all of us. It does not belong to Google or Facebook.
I mean, we have empirical evidence that Google is participating in self-serving bias in a way that directly harms consumers. As a society, as a democracy, anytime you have concentration at the levels they are in the information sector, it should be concerning because they really are now more powerful than governments. They are a form of regulator, but they are a private regulator with no democratic accountability.
I can't believe in a system in which the power is separate from the people. We're talking about, some pretty arrogant people, in my opinion, who think of themselves as gods of sort and who really want to have a complete hold over humanity. These are basically big mind control machines, and mind control machines, they're really good at controlling minds. It's going to be harder and harder to fight them if we don't do so, I would say, as soon as possible. The more rope we give them, the sooner we are all hanged.
I don't believe our species can survive unless we fix this. We cannot have a society in which if two people wish to communicate, the only way that can happen is if it's financed by a third person who wishes to manipulate them.
The traditional notion of totalitarianism was resting on the premise or the idea that a government would try to achieve total control over your life. And they would do it by using the might and muscle of government to do so under compulsion. Well, today we essentially have a totalitarian force in the world, and that is these large tech companies. But guess what? They didn't use stormtroopers, they didn't use the gulag, they didn't use the arrest of political prisoners to accomplish it. We all opted in to do it ourselves. We volunteered for this arrangement. And we live in a world today where these tech giants have a level of control and an ability to manipulate us that Stalin, Mao, Hitler, and Mussolini could only have dreamed of. The power is immense, and we are essentially trusting these large tech companies to make the right and good decision for us. I, for one, am not prepared to cede that level of power to these individuals.
In the meantime, if the companies won't change, delete your accounts, okay?